Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series called Anglo-Saxons versus Vikings. In part 1, End of a Golden Age, we will talk about the rise of England's most unready king. During the 10th century, Anglo-Saxon England enjoyed a golden age. At the century's dawn, King Alfred the Great of Wessex drove the Vikings from his kingdom. His son and daughter, Edward the Elder and Lady Ethelred of Mercia, drove the Vikings from the other occupied Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In doing so, they subjugated their ancient rivals and created a new kingdom called England. Later kings, most famously Aethelstan, provided support to monasteries, which became centers of scholarship, strengthened the kingdom, and asserted supremacy over Wales and Scotland. In the year 959 AD, the kingdom came under the rule of a teenaged monarch named Edgar the Peaceful. He received counsel from the revered Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, who made protection of the monasteries his great mission at court. For nearly a generation, peace reigned in England, a remarkable feat for the early Middle Ages. It came as a terrible shock when death came for Edgar the Peaceful on July 8, 975, when he was 33 years old. One contemporary lamented, "The commonwealth of the entire realm was shaken." Thankfully, Edgar the Peaceful left 4 children to continue the House of Wessex. Sadly, he did not live up to his regnal title in his family life. He once abducted a nun named Wilfrida from her convent and made her his concubine. He also stole his counselor's wife from him, making her Queen Elfrith. This meant several heirs with conflicting claims. With his first wife Ethelred, he had 2 sons named Edward and Edmund. With Wilfrida, he had a daughter named Edith and a 3rd son born to Queen Elfrith named Ethelred. Edgar the Peaceful intended for Ethelred, the son of his most recent wife, to follow him to the throne. However, Ethelred remained a child of 7 at the time of his father's death, while his half-brother Edward was 14 years old. More importantly, Edward had the enthusiastic support of Archbishop Dunstan, who hoped to mold Edward into a model Christian king. Despite the efforts of Elfrith and her supporters, on March 976, the princes and prelates of England crowned Edward as their king. Dunstan and his supporters hoped that Edward's coronation would keep the country at peace and silence Elfrith's supporters. Instead, the kingdom slipped into a state near civil war. Elfrith's kinsmen and supporters hoped for a pliant king who would allow them to plunder the monasteries. And despite Edward being on the throne, the West Saxon notables began hiring gangs of toughs to attack the monasteries, beat up the monks, and seize their property. During this troubled time, the chroniclers reported a comet in the sky, which they called a hairy star, said to bode ill for England. Yet more omens arrived in bad weather that caused the crops to fail, leading to a terrible famine. English peasants began making bread out of lichens, peas, and even moss. Finally, the king's supporters called for a council in Calne during the year 978 to restore order. During the meeting, the floor of the upper room where the churchmen and nobility assembled suddenly collapsed. Only Dunstan, fortuitously standing over a rafter, survived unhurt. Dunstan hailed his survival as a miracle, but this did little to mask the extent of the disaster. Dozens of Edward's leading supporters were either killed or maimed for life. The Calne disaster also allowed the young king's opponents to again look towards his half-brother Ethelred, then staying with his mother at her house in Dorset. After all, God plainly did not favor their current King Edward. Why else would he send such a terrible omen? Lady Elfrith kept a low profile during the troubles of Edward's reign, yet she remained a powerful force, the leader of the anti-monastic bloc. On March 18, 978, she invited King Edward, still only 16 or 17 years old, to her house to continue the peace talks. As King Edward arrived at his stepmother's residence, the nobles and chief men who stayed with the Queen came out to greet King Edward. As the young king reached for a cup, one man pulled Edward's right arm towards him as if he wished to offer the king a kiss of welcome. Another then seized Edward's left arm and stabbed him with a dagger. King Edward cried out in horror, "What are you doing, breaking my arm?" As he shouted, more men set upon him until he tumbled backwards over his saddle. The teenager's foot caught in a stirrup as his mount bolted. The charging horse dragged Edward to his death. It is not known for certain if Lady Elfrith ordered her stepson's murder. None of the early accounts of the death directly laid blame at her feet, yet her supporters committed the murder in her residence, so it is hard to believe that she is innocent. Regardless of guilt, Elfrith and Ethelred gained much from Edward's murder. Ethelred's coronation took place at Kingston upon Thames on April 14, 979, organized by a reluctant Archbishop Dunstan. After Edward's murder, astrologers and seers attached to the new royal family learned of a red cloud the color of fire which vanished at the first streaks of dawn's light. They took this as a portent of evil. Nonetheless, the 11-year-old Ethelred behaved well during his coronation, impressing even his mother's enemies with good manners and behavior. Yet all knew he could not possibly govern. When the boy king took the usual oath to govern well, Dunstan addressed him in solemn warning, rebuking the murder which made him king. And Dunstan further prophesied that grave misfortune would soon befall England. For now, that did not trouble Lady Elfrith and her ally, Bishop Ethelwald. They packed the court with their flunkies, and Dunstan, sensing no place for him at the court, withdrew to Canterbury and devoted himself to guiding the church. None of them knew it yet, but Anglo-Saxon England's golden age came to an end with the rise of the boy king who would be remembered as Ethelred the Unready. That wraps things up for this episode of the Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.